very short. A warm welcome, everybody in the Balie. My name is Eelco Bossch van Rosenthal, and I would like to start right off the bat with a warm welcome to our guest of honor tonight, Larry Siedentop. Please give him a warm many ways to introduce him. The acclaimed author of many books, including Democracy in Europe from 2001, Inventing the Individual from 2014, and of course he wrote an intellectual biography of your big hero you said over dinner, Larry Siedentop, who laid the groundwork for modern political liberalism. And Mr. Siedentop will hold his keynote in a minute. We'll look at the state of Europe tonight, rethinking Europe. How urgent is it to rethink Europe after Brexit, after populist movements before Trump and after Trump? Some have died down, others have risen. And the question is, do these populist movements threaten European unity? That's what we'll be talking about. And to what extent is liberalism the solution? And if it is, what kind of liberalism is the solution? Is it Mr. Macron's or Mr. Rutte or none of the above? Or maybe do we need to invent a new kind of political liberalism tonight? We have an hour and a half to do that. I don't know if that's enough time. But let's see how far we get. Mr. Siedentop last year put its thoughts to paper in a book that was published in the context of the Forum for European Culture, Rethinking Europe, which is on sale tonight as well, I have to add. So that's Mr. Siedentop in about a minute. After that, Bastiaan Rijpkema, legal philosopher at the University of Leiden, and if I'm not mistaken, 51 years your junior. He will do a brief reflection on Mr. Siedentop's ideas. And after that, we'll talk to both guests here in the Q&A with obviously plenty of room for everybody here to ask questions. Well, not everybody, but most of the people. So this is why we're here. The Forum is an initiative of Dutch Culture and the Balie, and it has been made possible by the Giske Strijbes Foundation. The Forum on European Culture was first organized in 2016. There'll be another longer edition next summer, end of May, early June. But with everything going on, we didn't want to wait this long, and that's why we have this emergency edition. Let's put it like that. With that, please, another warm applause for Mr. Larry Siedentop.
Is that the right position for the microphone? Good. Well, first I want to thank Balie and Marine for help in organizing all of this. It's a pleasure to be here in Amsterdam and in the country to which I'm rather attached. Where to start? In 2000, when I published Democracy in Europe, the first sentence was, democratic legitimacy in Europe is at risk. Why did I say that? Well, it seems to me the object of a properly working liberal democratic system is to create and sustain what might be called a culture of consent. That is an attitude, a habit of looking on the law as something, prima facie at least, to be obeyed. Suspending disbelief is an important part of a culture of consent. And I think if we ask whether the European Union has succeeded in creating such a culture, the answer is probably not. So why not? By the way, over lunch with one of the Dutch ambassadors to London some years ago, he finished lunch by saying to me, Larry, we have this saying in the Netherlands that the English are too polite to be frank, and the Dutch are too frank to be polite. I'm going to try to be both tonight. But I want to talk, at least in part, about Brexit, but about more than Brexit. Why has the EU not really created what I call the culture of consent? Well, I think there are a number of reasons, but one of the most important goes back to an early mistake, I think it was 1979, when it was decided to change the mode of election to the European Parliament from indirect election from national legislatures to direct election from constituencies across the Union. And that seemed to me to cut the connection between national parliamentary classes and the European project. And that has had very serious consequences, I think. I'd just like to read something I wrote a few years ago to make that point. It's the only thing I will read, I promise you. If the work of the European Council involves and helps to educate ministers and other members across Europe, other members of national executives in the affairs of the Union, it is much less successful in reaching and educating the parliamentary classes of member states. That in turn means that it has failed to employ the chief existing means provided by the political systems of member states for mobilizing and shaping opinion across the continent. Indeed, it has given national parliamentary classes an excuse for distancing themselves from the European Parliament, from the European project. And here we come up against a major unintended consequence of the direct election of the European Parliament. The original model was for one with its members chosen from their national parliaments. The move to direct election of the European Parliament cut the link between national parliamentary classes and the European project. The move was, to say the least, premature. The steadily falling turnouts for successive European parliamentary elections is symptomatic. Yet the failure of the European Parliament to develop any ability to mobilize and shape consent across the continent has, in fact, created a major threat to political life in Europe. While the European Parliament has not developed any hold over opinion, its powers have nonetheless been steadily increased. What is the upshot? On the one hand, we have national parliaments that retain popular authority, while their power has been steadily reduced. And on the other hand, we have the European Parliament, which has increased powers but very little popular authority. This situation opens the door to populism. For the question arises, who represents us? And uncertainty about the answer to that question is the seedbed of populism. It can call into question the claims of representative government as such. It seemed to me when I wrote Democracy in Europe well, it was 1999, 2000, that what was already very clear was that the process of integration was moving from one stage to another. In its earliest decades, integration touched chiefly interests, mostly material interests. But it was in the 1990s moving into another stage in which it began to touch identities, national identities. And that seemed to me obviously going to be a much more difficult and perhaps dangerous process. The failure to anticipate that, even now, seems to me rather odd. But it was the 1990s, when this transition was taking place, should, I think, have been a period of pausing and considering very carefully how the next steps should be taken. Instead, one saw in the 1990s an acceleration of integration, not least because of the of German reunification and the reaction to German reunification, especially in France, and the desire to push on with the project of a euro as rapidly as possible. That speeding up of the process of integration at this point where the whole process was beginning to touch not just interests but identities, seemed to me ill-advised and dangerous, frankly. The proper advice, it seemed to me, to European legislators and the political classes at that stage would have been make, it's an old English adage, make haste slowly. And instead, as I said, the 90s saw tremendous acceleration. And I think it's no accident that one can trace the beginnings of Euroscepticism back to that period. After 2000, of course, it was fed, reinforced by massive immigration, by the loss of national currencies, and in due course by the euro crisis, which it seems to me has sadly, perhaps worse, created resentments both on the side of the lenders and on the side of the recipients, and has certainly not contributed to harmony in the development of European integration. Perhaps, as I say, having said what I did about this comment made to me by the Dutch ambassador, I should put my cards on the table. I voted to remain, but rather reluctantly. And in a way, what I'm doing is trying to explain to you why there was a bit of reluctance. I mean, I think the project of European integration is a noble project, but the goals are still open and open to discussion. In the last decade, significant political movements in member states, even Germany, have emerged, reviving liberal fears about bleak nationalism and extremism. And it's usual to describe these developments as the threat of populism. Well, I think we have to be careful in using that word, populism, more careful than we often are, because I think the danger is, at least as I see it, that across Europe at the moment, in some of these movements of reaction, there are two rather distinct groups combined. That is, what you might call bleak nationalists, anti-liberal, illiberal movements, and on the other hand, liberals who are worried about the future of self-government in Europe. And I think one of the risks of using this category, populist, too loosely, is that there's a risk that those really concerned who are not illiberal but are concerned about self-government can maybe driven into a more extreme camp than they would necessarily belong to. So I think we should be awfully careful about using this term, populist. Was Brexit? Is Brexit? Were Brexiteers populists? Maybe some, but by no means the majority, I think. So the difficulty of distinguishing between extremism and legitimate concern for self-government is something we should bear in mind. Why has all of this, or these developments, led to such dramatic developments, first of all in the United Kingdom, with the referendum and the Brexit vote? Well, and this, I think, is something that hasn't really been written about, spoken about, or is very widely understood. I think here one has to consider the nature of the British Constitution. It poses special problems in relation to the process, to European integration. It's almost primitive simplicity. That is, the norm underlying the British political system, as you know, is the sovereignty of the Crown in Parliament. And that's it. I mean, there's no elaborate normative structure built into most codified or written constitutions. It gives the British Constitution, you might call it, describe it as an all-or-nothing characteristic. And that has come into play increasingly in the UK in recent years. Either one is governing oneself or not. And let me fall back here on a comment made by my mentor, Alexis de Tocqueville, who once said, "The English see things very clearly, but they can only see one thing at a time." Now, that is actually connected with the nature of the British parliamentary system and the nature of sovereignty as understood in the UK. It's not dispersed. It's not shared sovereignty. It's the sovereignty of the Crown in Parliament that I think has shaped British public attitudes, the public mind, if you want to call it that, over nearly 3 centuries of parliamentary government. And that habit of gradual modified reform has weakened the British sense of, as it were, dealing with the system in totality. It's why constitutional concerns, I mean, in some ways, I think the British political class is semi-literate constitutionally. And that emerges not least in a widespread, I think, confusion in British media, British public life, between federalism and centralization. Well, historically, the chief object of federal systems is to limit centralization, is to disperse authority and power. And yet, very often in the British media and in British public argument, federalism is used to stand for centralization. That hardly helps the cause of European integration as far as the United Kingdom is concerned. So that all or nothing characteristic of this unwritten constitution has important consequences. And the consequences at the moment, at this period of negotiation, are emerging in the, I would say, the confusion and near panic in London. Because unlike countries with a written, codified constitution, the unwritten constitution means that, if I can use a slightly morbid metaphor and compare this process to dissecting a corpse, in this course, trying to remove the flesh from the bones. In this case, the only bone is the backbone. I mean, the sovereignty of the Crown in Parliament. The rest of the skeleton is missing. And I used to tell students, say to students in Oxford, perhaps the best definition of the British Constitution is what happens. And the truth is, a great deal has happened in 43 years since Britain became associated with the project of European integration. And the fact that the British so-called Constitution amounts to an accumulation of practices means that there's 43 years of practices accumulated. And the difficulty of trying to introduce order into that and systematically dispose of things that from the European Union that are not wanted and those that are thought important to retain, the difficulty of making that distinction emerges in a bill currently before Parliament, which would, on the day of exit, make all British EU regulations and laws part of the British legal system, and give to the executive, the right to retain or modify or abolish these practices stemming from Brussels. Now, that illustrates, I think, the terrible irony of the Brexiteers movement in the UK, not unlike, you might say, the irony attached to the Tea Party movement in the United States. That is, what they ostensibly are out to restore and defend. In the one case, the American Constitution. In the other case, the sovereignty of the Crown in Parliament. What they're ostensibly setting about to defend, they are in fact endangering. And already, I think it's fair to say that the parliamentary sovereignty has been quite seriously damaged by the referendum and the consequences of the referendum. There's a great deal of argument about whether Parliament would have the right, first of all, to be presented with the consequences of these negotiations, and secondly, even perhaps the right to turn down the result of the negotiations and either on its own authority remain in the EU or call another referendum. I mean, in that way, parliamentary sovereignty has been shaken, disturbed, perhaps damaged. And that's certainly very serious for the British system of representative government in its traditional form. So I'm sorry about that metaphor of the corpse, but it does seem to me that where do you start? Where do you stop? Cutting away this accumulation of practices, and on the basis of what principles? Principles of selection. It's all very obscure, and that's why I think London is rather stymied at the moment, frankly. We should bear in mind two things, I think, in this connection. And this goes back to what I was saying about the importance of not using populists carelessly, too loosely, because you might confuse two rather different groups and drive the liberals into an illiberal posture. If you look at the referendum in the United Kingdom. And there's been quite a lot of research of the group, of the areas, looking closely at the areas that voted to leave. I think it's very clear that the Brexit vote was not chauvinistic. It was not dominated by hostility to immigration. The British society is remarkably open. And if there have been worries about the numbers of immigration and controlling them, it's a far cry from resisting immigration as such. I mean, the UK is hardly imaginable without immigration, as anyone who's lived or worked there will know. And there isn't a kind of instinctive reaction against immigrants that I think one does find in some parts of Europe. No, the real motive was, and it's both underlined by and, as I've tried to indicate, limited by the nature of the British Constitution, was we want to rule ourselves again. You know, we want to make our own laws. That all or nothing attitude set in, which is certainly in a way a product of the unwritten Constitution, is what contributed to what one might see as a simplistic turn of the argument taken in the UK. But I think the surveys and studies do suggest that concern with self-government, we should govern ourselves, was the dominant motive in the British vote. After all, the existence of the EU has also, the mere existence of the EU, I think, has certain consequences across the Union. And one of them certainly, which has some similarity with Brexit, but more differences, I think, are separatist movements. Certainly, I think if the EU hadn't existed, there would have been no Scottish nationalist movement of the kind we know. And arguably the same applies to that notable part of Spain currently before us. I think, you know, attacks on the sovereignty of existing member states is an area which the EU, again, might have foreseen problems. Years ago in Brussels, I asked a number of commissioners because I'd spent a term in Madrid and realized just how firmly, let's say, at least it seemed to me then, this was 2004, the Spanish government might deal with an attempt by Catalonia to leave the Spanish state. I used firmly, advisedly. And I remember asking in Brussels, well, what preparations has the Commission made for this contingency? That is, when part of an existing member state leaves that state and applies for membership of the EU. And the answer was, of course, no preparation whatsoever. That lack of preparation actually hurt the Scottish nationalists at one point during the campaign before the Scottish referendum, because they had, I think, simply been, the Scottish nationalists had been assuming that Brussels would welcome an independent Scotland, and that would probably be considered, having been part of the United Kingdom, already a member of the European Union. Well, it turned out otherwise, not least because Madrid made its view forcibly clear to the Commission, I think, at that point. So the EU could and should, I think, have been more prescient about some of the unintended consequences of its own existence. Not so difficult to identify something like the separatist temptation, let's call it that. I think it's interesting at the moment how all these developments affect Germany. In November, I wrote something for the Wall Street Journal about the return of the German question, and it does seem to me that one of the almost certain consequences of Brexit will be German domination of the European Union. Now, I don't think that's something Germany actively seeks. But you could say, almost say, that it's being forced upon it by events. I mean, if you look at Germany's attitude towards the European Union in its early stages, it's an attitude that was shaped by its own constitutional tradition since the end of the Second World War. That is a federalist tradition, a system which disperses authority and power, and a system very often defended very firmly by the German Constitutional Court. And for a time, it seemed to me, the German Constitutional Court was that agency in the European Union that most effectively was warning against excessive centralization. In some of its decisions, it certainly seemed that it was laying down firm limits. Whether the court will proceed further in that direction and actually, for instance, in its dealings with cases arising out of what some German professors consider the abuses introduced by the European Central Bank and its use of authority, which it doesn't have, allegedly. Whether the court will effectively act against such things remains to be seen. It may draw back. There's some evidence that it has. But it seems to me that the German attitude or approach to European integration has changed pretty fundamentally as a result of the euro crisis. Since the German government decided that the survival of integration of the European Union depended on the survival of the euro, it has hitched itself to what we might call a radical centralizing project. I mean, if you accept that fiscal centralization is entailed by monetary, by shared currency. And I think that has created a kind of tension in Germany, because I think in some ways they realize that this commitment is not entirely consistent with their original approach to European integration, and these federalist instincts remain alive and I would say operational within Germany. But the trouble is events. You remember Harold Macmillan, the British Prime Minister, was famously said, in trouble when asked what's what he found difficult as a politician. He said, "Events, dear boy, events." Well, events keep pushing Germany in the direction of making decisions about the Eurozone and perhaps by implication the development of the European Union as a whole. So I think Germany is of a mixed mind at the moment, but events seem to be, and its response to events seem to be pushing it in a direction which runs contrary to its initial attitude about integration. These extraordinarily difficult negotiations going on over Brexit at the moment, and they are going to be very, very difficult, maybe inconclusive at the end. Can they have any positive outcome? Can there be anything to be gained by the European Union in the best possible scenario? Well, I think there is something which could, but probably won't, but could emerge, and that is the model of a two-tier Europe. That is, with an outer sphere which had the means of containing current arrangements as different as those of Norway and Sweden, Norway and Denmark, Norway and Switzerland. It wouldn't be easy to put together such an arrangement, and I'm sure that many would oppose it because they thought anything that looked half attractive might serve as a magnet for some existing member states to move to the outer sphere, and that should be prevented at almost any cost. Well, first of all, I don't see that would necessarily be a bad thing if there were such a clearly demarcated outer sphere of membership. The European Union is not quite like the American states at the beginning of the Civil War, and I hope. So that seems to be one possible, though probably not likely, consequence of all these negotiations. But I don't pretend to be overly optimistic about it. Well, enough about Brexit. If one applies the notion of self-government across Europe, and one wants the European Union to develop into something which could create and sustain what I called at the beginning a culture of consent. And introduces the notion of self-government and applies it to Europe as a whole. What is the self that would be governed? That is, there is a growing question in a way, I think, about European identity, not just member states' identity, but European identity. The cultural changes and technological changes seem to me to be undermining traditional categories awfully rapidly, and may jeopardize representative government as such increasingly. Talking to undergraduates recently, several of them said, in Oxford, several of them said to me, well, you know, I don't have a memory. I don't take the trouble of constructing a memory, because they're so used to finding anything they need online so quickly that it seems almost a pointless exercise setting about creating a memory. But of course, in my view, creating a memory is pretty essential to creating a self. And a self with some part of a political and national and political tradition has been what underlay the development of representative institutions across the Western world. And if that self, if that identity is no longer present, what becomes of the notion of self-government? It is some risk of dissolving, I think. And what I think is worrying is that this habit of almost immediate communication, immediate expression of opinion and expecting an immediate reaction to an expression of opinion is subversive of what is a necessary condition of representative government, that is, the emergence of a political class to which the population shows a degree of deference, on the assumption that such a class will have the leisure and the knowledge to establish the best route for public policy over a wide range of questions. That role for a political class sustaining representative institutions, I think, may be being compromised now. And this is where I think the term populism can perhaps still be used with reason. So, in my more recent book, my Inventing the Individual, I suppose I've set about trying to create an alternative narrative, something that might underpin European identity. And the route I took was this. One has to start at the right point and ask the right question, I think. And I think the right question, if one's trying to identify the particularity of the Western experience and of Europe, the right place to start is probably here. Historically, most human societies have been organized around the claims of the family, the tribe, or the caste. What is distinctive about Western countries, I think, is that they've come to be organized around the claims of the individual, and hence the importance of the language of rights in Western political tradition. So what I argue is, against a background of using, first of all, ancient Greece and Rome as societies where the underlying assumption was one of natural inequalities, so that what we would bring into arguments about justice are simply assumed to be there. They don't need justification. And these are natural inequalities. What I argue the early Christian movement did was in effect overturn the assumption of natural inequality and substituted that of moral equality based on the nature of human agency. What these early Christian thinkers, fathers, so-called philosophers by training, did, it seemed to me, was change the older, in the ancient world, model of the self, which was a model of appetite struggling with reason, or reason struggling with appetite. And between those two features of the self, what the early Christian movement did was introduce the will. And the will was by definition free, but also fallible. And what you get it from very early and consistent in Christian thought is that an almost equal emphasis on the freedom of the will and on its weakness or its fallibility. And that, I think, is the premise underlying liberal democracy. And in that sense, what I try to do in the book is trace the stages, the chief stages of the development in one of the early stages. The care of souls is introduced. It becomes quite important by the Carolingian period and begins to undercut assumptions about status differences, traditional, i.e., in the older view, natural status differences. But our idea of justice is transformed by the move away from the assumption of natural inequality to that of moral equality. Because then inequalities of status and treatment need justification in a way that they don't in societies founded on the assumption of natural inequality. Well, that's my attempt to, all too briefly, to begin to establish an alternative narrative about European identity. I'll finish there.
Given the time, Will, thank you for this. That was excellent. We'll cut to the audience. If there's somebody with a question right away, we'll get to more at the end. But if there's somebody with a question for Mr. Siedentop right away, stand up or scream. No? Because if you don't, I have one...
Screams are not welcome.
Oh. This is Amsterdam. People scream. One question from me, because you... Oh, there's a question here. Go ahead.
I was listening to you quite intensely, and you mentioned about the Catalonia problem at this moment, and related that to Scotland. And I couldn't help but think, do you see these separatist movements as a great threat to what you call the German problem? And I'm thinking especially in Yugoslavia, when Croatia said, hey, we're quite rich, we don't need Serbia, we're independent, and Germany recognized them right away, and that caused the Balkan Wars.
Yeah.
And then now Catalonia, or Scotland, and now Lombardy, who have 20% of the nation's GDP, they're having a referendum now because they want independence. Veneto, 5% of the population, but with 10% of the GDP. All these split things, this is going to destroy. Europe will never get together because the rich people or the rich provinces, they want independence, they want cessation.
What's your question?
My question is a European unity possible in the modern postmodernism liberal world where separation, determinism is becoming so much more important?
I think it's more difficult. I agree. I don't think it's impossible. It's quite interesting that the Catalan Prime Minister has taken refuge in Belgium, I think. The truth is, far from resisting separatist temptations, there was for a time, I think it's much less true now than it was 20, 25 years ago. There were those in Brussels, in the regionalism area of the Commission, who would have welcomed the unpicking of the major nation states, I think. Why? Because it was likely to lead to more power going to the center. And that, threat of regionalism has I think, been present in the EU from the beginning. But I think since then, not least because of interventions by the Spanish government, the Commission is less tempted in that direction, let's say.
Thank you so much. We'll hear a lot more in about 10 minutes, but until then, Bastiaan Rijpkema will reflect on Mr. Siedentop's keynote speech. Thank you.
Thank you. The Balie has, again, an excellent sense for timing. Of course, it's evidently always a good idea to invite Larry Siedentop, one of Europe's most renowned liberal thinkers, to discuss the future of the liberal idea. But it's even more appropriate given the emboldened opponents that confront liberalism today. One of those opponents is the Russian political philosopher Alexander Dugin. Dutch daily NRC Handelsblad ran a large interview with him this weekend, and next Saturday he is speaking here in Amsterdam at the Nexus conference, debating, among others, a former Obama strategist. Dugin, a former fascist and currently, in any case, a reactionary, is said to be an important informal ideologue of the Kremlin. Although his exact influence is disputed, in his NRC interview, Dugin, among other things, says Ukraine was responsible for the downing of the MH17, that the overwhelming evidence that points to the contrary is all politics, and he contends that it's naive to think that the Dutch public prosecutor is independent. Statements you would expect to find on an obscure internet forum. It would be easy, therefore, to not take him seriously, to think this is just another lunatic or complot theorist. But it would be a mistake. Dugin's remarks on MH17 are part of a broader system of thinking. One that consists of an attack on the concept of truth, on individualism, of reason and democracy. In several interviews, the one with NRC, but also, for instance, the BBC, we see how Dugin praises the particular over the universal, how he praises or pleads for relativism over truth, and argues against democracy and equal rights as we know them. Dugin argues for a radical rejection of the universal liberal idea. Of course, it's already quite disconcerting to think that Dugin is actually somewhere or somehow inside Putin's head. Well, and it's, to add to this, also somewhat disconcerting to note that his ideas seem to have a certain appeal to the radical right in Europe. His book, The Fourth Political Theory, for instance, was published in English in 2012 with a foreword by Alain Soral, a French author convicted and fined for anti-Semitism and a former member of the Front National's campaign team in 2007. But more important, however, is the broader intellectual attack on liberalism, of which he is only one example. Dugin is by no means alone. Other versions of anti-liberalism are gaining ground in Europe. And I want to stress first, I do not want to equate them one-on-one with Dugin's full-blown reactionary thinking, but they do share its rejection of liberalism, at least as a political principle. In July 2014, Orbán held a now infamous speech at a student summer camp. His political party in Hungary, Fidesz, just won the parliamentary elections and retained its two-thirds majority in parliament. In his speech, Orbán pointed to Russia and Turkey as examples of successful non-liberal states. And Orbán told his audience that he too in Hungary was building an illiberal state organized around a special national approach. And I quote from the kind Hungarian government's website, from this speech translated in English by the government. So this is Orbán speaking. We had to state that a democracy does not necessarily have to be liberal. Just because a state is not liberal, it can still be a democracy. And in fact, we also had and did state that societies that are built on the state organization principle of liberal democracy will probably be incapable of maintaining their global competitiveness in the upcoming decades and will instead be scaled down unless they are capable of changing themselves significantly. End of the quote. Now, after almost 8 years of Fidesz in power, we know what this means. The Hungarian Constitutional Court was muzzled, its power of review was reduced to checking procedures, and its president was removed. The largest opposition newspaper was closed, the electoral districts were redrawn in such a way that 45% of the vote resulted in 2/3 of the parliamentary seats for Fidesz. Neutral institutions as the central bank and the public prosecutor were turned into Fidesz-dominated bodies. And a constitutional expert as Kim Leen Scheppele, doing excellent and invaluable work in tracking these developments in Hungary, already argued back in 2013 that, I quote, it's nearly impossible for the opposition to win an election in Hungary. And if they would win, it's doubtful how much it would actually change in Hungary, given the fact how strong Fidesz has entrenched itself in the political system in Hungary. So what should Europe's response be? How should liberals respond? First, we should recognize that this is a new intellectual challenge to liberalism and recognize it for what it is. A blunt rejection of the most fundamental tenets of liberalism and liberal democracy. Let me be clear and repeat once again that I do not want to equate Dugin's reactionary anti-liberalism with that of Orbán, but I do want to stress that what you could read in the NRC newspaper this weekend is not only something outside of us, something only an odd-thinking Russian government ideologue says. Anti-liberalism is in Europe, although in a different version. Second, the EU needs to reevaluate the way it deals with threats to democracy and the rule of law. The EU instruments at the moment are imbalanced. The so-called nuclear option of Article 7, it means that you are going to suspend the rights of a member state, is so far-reaching that it's unpractical and unlikely to ever be used as an effective instrument against democratic backsliding in a member state. Its use is also hindered by the way it is designed. Other member states have a veto, and the reason Poland is not giving in to Timmermans' threats of activating Article 7 is exactly this. They know Article 7 will not be used, and legally cannot even be used, because Hungary has repeatedly declared that it will use its veto against any sanctions that are proposed to be imposed on Poland. Far more realistic would be to think of economic sanctions. As some jurists already have suggested, Hungary is a very large net receiver of EU subsidies. So you might say the EU could rethink if it wants to subsidize the building of an illiberal state in its midst. But most importantly, we have to do what we are doing here tonight, and for which Larry Siedentop's work is so important, discussing, evaluating refining and defending liberalism and liberal democracy as an idea. Thank you.
Thank you, Bastiaan. You can sit over here. One question about what you both mentioned, the recent populism, and I'm wondering, I don't need to use this, I think. I'm wondering if there's a silver lining in the sense that these things are usually circular. If you look at the US, you're born in Chicago. After Bush came Obama. After Obama came Trump as a direct response to Obama. If we would say Trump is illiberal in many ways, we can expect an anti-Trump after this, a polar opposite. And perhaps it's the same in Europe. Is that actually the case? Is it circular, and is there some comfort in that? Or is this actually a critical time, critical crossroads?
I wouldn't rely too much on circularity, I think. I was watching something on BBC World recently, reporting on students at Berkeley and their reaction to some Trump supporters appearing at their meetings, and it seemed to be their willingness to resort to violence, open, unapologetic inclination to respond to these provocations with violence.
On both sides in Berkeley, I mean,
yes.
It's hard for Trump supporters to speak out as well.
It suggests that there is a quite a fundamental change of mood among students. I'm particularly upset by and opposed to this misuse of a metaphor when there's talk about private spaces. The metaphor is dangerous because, whereas obviously it's very important in making a distinction between physical aggression, physical violence, and non-violence, to the life of the mind, this model is a great danger.
Bastiaan, there was obviously, let's say, among the liberals in Europe, a sense of relief after the French elections, after the Dutch elections. I guess in Germany it's more of a mixed, with the Alternative für Deutschland entering parliament. Was that a false sense of relief? I think you want to... Right.
It was a false sense of it. And it seems to me some of the Commission spokesmen really overdid it.
Okay.
I mean, tell me if I'm wrong, but in fact, Wilders' party increased its number of seats. Is that right?
Wilders' party?
Yes.
No, yeah, they did. But
yes. And I think Le Pen's party, its hold on the vote was larger than it had ever been before.
Because here was the matter, they didn't enter
and we know
coalition.
what happened in Germany more recently still. So the idea that, this is subsiding now and we can carry on as before is ill-judged.
And go ahead.
I think it's interesting, the reaction of European Commission, of course, but also I think the reaction in Holland was interesting. Maybe you heard of it, but Prime Minister Rutte made it a series of finals. So we had a quarter-final in Holland, and we had the semi-final in France, and the final in Germany. I think it's also a bit pathological because we cannot manage to take part in any European or World Football Cup championship anymore. So we want to win some other finals or play them at least. Well, he was very optimistic. So he said we won the quarterfinal, and also Juncker was very optimistic after the French final. But I think I agree, of course, with Larry that the PVV is still the second party in Holland. Front National didn't manage to make Le Pen the president of France, but this is more due to the way the election is organized in France, and not because of the decreased support of the party. So I think we should not be too overly optimistic.
When you make the distinction, as you did, you say be careful with using the phrase, the word populism, because it doesn't make enough distinction between the bleak nationalists and those worried about the loss of sovereignty. It seems, though, that if you look at Brexit or in the Netherlands, PVV, that at least the leaders of these movements can often be seen as populist or bleak nationalists, maybe not the voters.
Not in the
such.
UK, I think.
Not Farage.
Not in the UK, I think. Germany, I'm not so sure. I would have thought I worry about confusing two separate groups.
You wouldn't say Farage.
I would apply that very much to the German case. I think there are probably, many Germans, basically liberal, who are, well, frankly, I think one of the few universal social truths is too much immigration too quickly is bad for both sides. And, I can in a way understand sudden access of anxiety in Germany after Frau Merkel's decision to admit almost in an unlimited way so suddenly. So I think it is an important distinction.
Do you agree?
I think it's important also to have a clear definition of what populism is. And I think a very useful definition is one by Jan Werner Müller, is a political scientist, and he says very short that populism is those are parties or politicians that are anti-elite, but that's not very rare. That is common. There are a lot of parties that are anti-elite, but they combine this being anti-elite with being also anti-pluralism. So I think you can see this clearly with the PVV in Holland, that they, in their language, in their program, in the speeches, they make clear that there is a part of Dutch society that does not have a place in their view of Dutch society, and those are Muslims, Dutch Muslims. They don't have a place in the view of Dutch society that the PVV puts in its speeches. But also you see this in Hungary, when you see that the government of Orbán does not like to allow other centers of power. So the constitutional court, in a pluralistic system, you share power between different institutions, and you see that the constitutional court is attacked by Orbán. And I think it's important to note that, so you have populism with these two characteristics. It's anti-elite, but more importantly, anti-pluralism, that this translates into proposals that touch or threaten the rule of law. I think you see this clearly with the proposal of the PVV in Holland to close down mosques. It touches it effectively abolishes the freedom of religion for one specific religion. And you see this, of course, with the measures I already mentioned in my talk earlier, the measures that Orbán takes against the constitutional court.
I would say one part of my definition of populism would be willingness to subvert representative government, if, on their view, the occasion was needed.
Let's look at the question whether liberalism is the solution, and then what kind of liberalism. Let's look at a brief video of, according to some at least 6 months ago, times have changed, the savior of European liberalism, Mr. Macron. Let's take a look.
I won in France against Marine Le Pen on a very clear basis and a very clear dialogue, which is the opposition between open and closed, European and nationalistic. I mean, it was a very clear discussion, a very clear deal. The whole story of Europe is about a series of wars trying to dominate the others. What we managed to build right after the Second World War is unique. Having 70 years of peace, which is brand new, it never existed in Europe. And I'm very attached to this principle because our values, our collective preferences are European. You have a strong attachment in the US to freedom, but with less attachment to equality than in Europe. You have a very strong attachment to market economy in China, but absolutely not the same relationship with freedom. This mix of capital markets, progress, equality and liberty is the DNA of Europe.
Now, this is one liberal. Another kind of liberal is our Prime Minister Rutte, who famously says and keeps repeating, if you want to discuss vision, go see an eye doctor. And that applies to Europe as well. There's no such thing needed as vision. What's the right kind of liberalism when it comes to providing an answer to populism? Is that Mr. Macron's?
Well, you know, one thing that happened, I think, post-1945, over decades, was, and it had a lot to do with the increasing importance of economics and economists in shaping public policy, was the collapse, in my view, of liberalism into utilitarianism, into, you know, what provided the kind of philosophical foundation of modern economic theory. And that emerges most starkly, I suppose, in neoliberalism, which seems to me to be a form of liberalism which doesn't deserve the name, and which deprives traditional classical liberalism of aspiration. It turns, you know, the market mechanism, and this is why I'm not quite sure about Monsieur Macron at times, whether there's something managerial and utilitarian and behind some of his comments, I think. But I think an important part of a properly liberal agenda now has to be to pull back from that identification, complete identification of liberalism with a market economy and with utilitarianism.
Mm-hmm. What do you see when you see Mr. Macron and the way he wants to speed things up in Europe?
I want to say about seeing something about Rutte and the eye doctor, if you allow me. I think it's very problematic. The view of Rutte was very problematic when it comes to the European Union during the elections, because Juncker from the European Commission made like a study with 5 options for the European Union. So they described like 5 options, like a menu you can choose from. Which way do we go as a union? More integration, even less integration, different options, economic integration, or the two-speed Europe. All this was in this package, which was meant as a discussion piece in the different national democracies. It was even launched, I think, a month or 3 weeks before the Dutch election. So you would say it was the perfect opportunity for Dutch politicians to make a clear choice. Well, I'll take option 2, or I want to make myself heard in Europe for option 4, and to let the people in the election actually have a choice, so that you can choose, well, I go for Buma, and Buma will try to go for the two-speed Europe, to think of something. But there was almost no interest or no attention given to this document in the election campaign, or the issue of European integration. And I think the big problem with this is that now we have elected politicians in March, and now we have to make these decisions in Europe. But we didn't choose them for their vision of Europe. And then, of course, the politicians will say, oh, no, European Union is giving us all these dictates and they're going this way, but I will stop Juncker of going to more integration because Juncker has too much vision, he has to go to the eye doctor. Well, I think you are fooling the Dutch citizens because the Dutch politicians don't want to make the issue clear. In the elections, you are robbing your own citizens of having a clear choice on European integration.
I think the problem facing the EU, I mean, I talked perhaps too much about Brexit and the inherent difficulty of the negotiations because of the unwritten constitution in Britain. But I think that facing the EU in the foreseeable future is the fact that there isn't just one Europe. There are three Europes, in my view. There's Western continental Europe, the original members, and a few of the early additional members. There's Eastern Europe, the post-communist countries, and there are the maritime countries, the Scandinavian countries, the UK. And I must say, when I was thinking about this, I wasn't quite sure where I was going to put the Netherlands. I would traditionally have put them among the maritime countries. And what is very interesting about the maritime countries is that they are the countries in Europe which have the deepest and traditions of self-government, of liberal representative government. Mm-hmm. And that, you know, is not something to be underestimated. So, in a curious way, Europe is more like the United States than I think than it ever used to be. If you take, for instance, since the latest admissions from Eastern Europe, the latest member states admitted to the Union, on a range of moral issues, abortion, homosexuality, and so forth. It's much more like the American scene than it was in the early post-war decades when Western European countries were pretty much on board for the same policies. That's no longer the case. I mean, and I don't see that changed in the moral dispositions.
Where do you get your hope when looking at Europe? We talked about independence movement, disintegration, Brexit. Where's the good news to be found?
The good news is that I think the young in Europe are on the whole very well educated. Mm-hmm. That isn't to say the education has been perfect. I do think, and this is again part of my worries about the future of representative government, is that the study of history has I suppose, declined relatively in importance to a number of other subjects in schools and universities.
But are they more?
And this is serious because you know, knowing how difficult it was to create liberal institutions and representative government is a very important, should be an important part of political discourse and political.
But being better educated doesn't necessarily make you more politically involved, or it can look at Thierry Baudet, who you met several times. You said earlier. I think many of his supporters are pretty highly educated. Yes. They have a completely different sense of Europe and European integration than you do.
Still, I think on the whole, better educated people are more open to argument, and argument is central to the culture of liberal democratic societies.
Where do you get your sense of hope, being a young,
in something old, actually, in having long democratic traditions, I think. So the maritime countries, but for instance, Holland has a long democratic tradition. I think this is one of the, interestingly enough, in the 30s, an important thinker of militant democracy. So the question how you can defend democracy wrote, is Carl Leuwenstein. He wrote that the most important predictor for democratic survival is probably having a democratic tradition. So you have economic crisis, also doesn't help, but having a democratic tradition can help the most for surviving as a democracy. And I think in this respect, the future based on the past looks quite bright for Holland.
My final question before we go to the audience is for you, because you said something at the end about how technology has perhaps been, you said it more eloquently, but let me rephrase it, harmful for democracy in a sense. I guess you could also argue the opposite, no matter how you feel about Trump, but the whole grassroots movement came about also because of social media and that kind of stuff, and that was not all fake news. I mean, it's a mixed bag, right? I mean, technology can also help spread the best things about democracy.
Yes, I mean, all for freedom of information and argument. It's liberal democracy, which is, I think, threatened by some of these developments. Not democracy as such. We have, really, after all, originally that was what we might call populist democracy in Greece. I think it's I mean, take the United States. Where, after all, the liberal traditions were pretty deeply installed, and it has important bastions like the court system and the Supreme Court, Bill of Rights. Nonetheless, certain trends are very worrying. I was frankly appalled to learn fairly recently that in American liberal arts colleges, which I mean, I'm a great believer in liberal arts education, but you know, the American students major in one subject, and more than 50% of young Americans now major in business studies. And you know, that seems to me to be consistent with what I was saying about, you know, utilitarianism and a kind of economism invading the public sphere. I mean, it always struck me. Let's go back to controversial decisions like, you know, George W. Bush and Blair's decision to invade Iraq without what we now would say thinking through the consequences carefully enough. Well, I think if you approach, and it's interesting if you look at the people around, say, American presidents, you know, they used to be mostly lawyers. But since, you could trace it back as far as Nixon, I suppose, but especially more recently than that, they're now often people with a background in PR or, you know, business. They're out of business schools. And, you know, business school language has invaded government and public policy, and even, I regret to say, universities.
In the UK as well.
Oh yes. And if you're an advisor of the President of the United States who's thinking of invading Iraq, I'm not sure I think cost-benefit analysis helps you very much in deciding whether it's going to be a good idea or not.
We can make one now, afterwards. I mean, very clear. We have time for audience questions, if there are any. Unless you're a business student, then you need to.
I'd like to ask a question about the race to the bottom of taxes and the role of companies in the European process. Do you think Europe will revert populism by making a stance against the companies at large, which can Europe protect, so to say?
The tax havens and everything.
I mean, the companies are profiting from the European integration.
Right.
All countries are played against each other, and in the end, only employees are paying taxes. Companies themselves find ways to evade them. And this is a source of unrest,
populism.
Populism.
Yes.
Would that help?
What strikes me is that the country to which, from which many of these multinationals developed, the United States, is actually on the domestic side in the United States. Regulation, the regulatory agencies are savage compared to their counterparts in Europe, certainly their counterparts in the United Kingdom, where, these companies may be fined $1 million or $2 million, which means nothing to them.
That may change in the US over the next few years, though.
There's a lot of room for change.
Yes. Yeah. So, yeah, go ahead.
I think I can understand where the question, of course, is coming from, but I doubt if it would help a lot. Actually, it's a bit of the mixed message that was also in the report of Juncker I described. He published earlier this year with the 5 challenges. I applaud that they offer this menu where you can have a democratic discussion of which way we have to go. But it's also a bit of a mixed message, because the language and the ideas in this report were really like, okay, we have to first explain things better, and we have to deliver on all kinds of things. So the different options of the menu were evaluated in terms of, is there broadband internet in the provinces or something, and also maybe you can imagine, can we make better regulation for multinationals? I think this is all these things, all delivering on promises and delivering on all these things are important, but I think the most prominent thing is, for discontent within the European Union, the feeling of citizens that they don't have a say in which way the European Union is developing. So you can deliver on all your promises, but I think the people want to decide which way these promises are going to go.
But it's hard to find a solution for that. While at the same time, people like Macron, they want to speed things up.
Of course, but I'm not per se against speeding things up. But I think citizens in the different democracies, citizens should have a say in this, and I think this is the big role that national politicians should play and should dare to play, instead of blaming afterwards that the European Union did something that they didn't foresee or that they couldn't stop.
Which is why Mr. Siedentop suggested a Senate in Europe made up from national parliamentarians.
Something has to be done about the present European Parliament, which is a monster.
Is that still the solution? You proposed that years ago, a Senate consisting of national parliamentarians. They're not listening.
I mean, these are national politicians who already have connection with a national audience and are responsive to national audiences.
And it would help bridge the gap.
Even if it was a Senate which met 3 months of the year and was charged with defending the principle of subsidiarity, which I notice has dropped out of public discussion very rapidly. It hasn't had much more effect in the European Union than it had in the Catholic Church, from whence it came.
More questions? Well, let's go to this gentleman first, because you already posed a question.
Thank you. What is it in illiberal thought and anti-pluralistic thinking that makes it so attractive to many people?
Illiberalism. It's very appealing.
Sorry, I'm not sure what the question is.
So what makes illiberal thinking, yes, and anti-pluralistic thinking so popular nowadays?
I'm not sure how much thinking I attach to illiberalism. I haven't seen any major works of defense.
But something must trigger it if it's not thinking.
I think it's partly that they don't have a clear sense of the duties that's and as well as rights imposed by a liberal democratic system, and this is why I said I thought the downgrading of history in a way in education is something worth noticing and worrying about. I'm not sure how much understanding there is of classical liberalism now. I mean, I do think what I said about classical liberalism collapsing into utilitarianism in the post-war period. Well, if you see it as the political sphere as a larger market, you have definite wants, preferences. Why not?
Can it also just be a sense that a strong man, whether it's Orban or Trump or Erdogan or whoever, will find the quickest way to a solution for my problems?
No, I think there is actually something else now that I think about it.
Not that, but something else.
Well, I think there was, tell me if I'm wrong, you can, it's very easy to criticize the UK in so many ways, rightly so. But one of the things about UK membership of the EU is there's been an argument about it from the beginning. Central to public discourse, central to public argument has been, is this project valid? Is it taking the form that it should take? And I have the impression that on the continent, governments fell in for decades into the habit which survives in the European Commission of just trying to suppress certain topics. If immigration is becoming a hot, what used to be called in the States a hot potato, you try to keep it away, and that there wasn't enough political argument about a range of issues, and people felt they were being cheated, really.
Bastiaan.
I think I have an answer, but it's from a French philosopher, so it's going to be quite a leap to translate this properly into English, but I'm going to try. Claude Lefort is a French political thinker, and I think he has a very important view on this. He argues that democracy is fundamentally without a foundation. So after historically after the Ancien Regime, when the head was chopped off of Louis, then the society became without a fundamental foundation. So there was not an anchor point outside society where the legitimacy of the rule could be attached to. Without such a foundation, it was religious, of course, but when now this religion is does not function in this way anymore, and democracy is without such a foundation, Lefort argues that in such society there will be always movements that try to give the same foundation inside society. So everybody knows that there is no ultimate answer anymore for outside society, like ultimate truths or absolute truths. So he's going to try, or these movements are going to try to tell a story of society that can function as a fundament, as a foundation. And the problem is that this always includes excluding certain parts of the society. So they want to create certainty within the society and say, well, this is the real society and the others don't belong in this society. And well, it creates, Lefort says, like a false sense of belonging. So maybe that's attractive in like the rhetoric of illiberal politicians. Yeah.
Good question, by the way. Yes, go ahead.
I think that one of the fundamentals of liberal democracy is having a good functioning economy and having good functioning businesses. And one of the things which is keeping Europe all together compact at the moment is the internal market, which is being an exponent of free business. And so I'm very taken aback by your negative stance about business. Because I think it's one of the most fundamental reasons that liberal democracy can still survive in Europe. And by the way, I'm a lecturer at the business school.
There you go. Can he stay?
By all means, I'm a liberal. No, well,
good question.
I'm not trying to diminish the importance of the market or a market economy. I believe in a market economy. But it's not the whole story. And I just think there's a kind of informal reductionism which is set in, which diminishes the importance of political argument, political decisions, and maybe what we call globalization has made that more of a problem. The feeling that market forces, which we don't, as it were, quite understand, are putting political autonomy at risk.
Let's go to a final question, I think. Go ahead. Yeah.
Larry, I'd like to come back to your point where you said that in the cradle of democracy in Greece, the assumption, the first assumption was there is a natural inequality in men, in people. Then this democracy became a model, was incorporated and has progressed. Liberalism has come along and individualism. And as you said, the church also said now there is moral equality. So everybody was suddenly the same and everybody had rights. Now I remember Socrates and Aristotle saying, democracy in the unbridled form where everybody is equal will ultimately lead to a dictator, because when everybody has the same rights, when children have the vote, when animals have rights... What's the
question? Let's go to the question.
The question is, I think populism is suddenly very appealing to people because democracy...
What's the question? Let's go to the question.
Okay, the question is, democracy doesn't work.
That's not a question.
Okay, do you think democracy...
Your view.
Do you think democracy is a workable model in the modern world?
Yes.
Let me do the follow-up. Why?
Yes. Populism is a manifestation of what Socrates predicted.
Well, because I believe in
People will march in.
I believe in individual freedom, and the possibilities of adapting to social and economic change. I don't admit that they're less than formidable, and that there are often failures, but I have a certain confidence in the future. Yes.
I'm so pleased. There's a Dutch saying that says, "Hoe beter de welvaart, hoe minder het gevoel van welbevinden." And that means how much better it goes for society, how much more discontented the people will be.
I would only want to say is... Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I only want to say that I think it's the best model from a political philosophy view. So if it doesn't work, we should make it work. Democracy.
We have 4 more minutes.
Ah.
Well, I just decided we have 4 more minutes. Actually, we don't. But so one more question from this area. Oh, I thought I saw. No? Okay.
Yes, thank you. No pressure for the final question, but I was struck by what Mr. Siedentop said about particularly the position of the German Bundesverfassungsgericht as being the primary agent for guarding against excessive centralization of the European Union. And I wonder how much trust should we place in these central courts, whether these are really the issues keeping centralization at bay, or should we leave it instead to the representative democracy, the parliaments, to decide on these issues?
Well, I think it's a false dilemma. I mean, I think a legal and political system which creates a final court and assigns it the defense of a range of rights has, whether it always succeeds in defending, or you could say even imposing such rights, is very arguable. I mean, but that its role in what one might say lifting up the whole political system, nonetheless, is very important. Yes, I mean there were times. Let me give you 2 examples. I think, for instance, in view of what happened, the role of the Supreme Court in the post-1945 period in really making effective rights that blacks had had in theory since the end of the Civil War. If the United Kingdom, which, given the sovereignty of Parliament and no Supreme Court in the same sense, had had such a court, the situation in Ireland, the Northern Ireland situation, and the balance between the Catholic and Protestant communities of Northern Ireland might have been addressed sooner and more effectively than was the case.
Yeah, I think we have to leave it at this. Bars open, even on Sunday evening. I want to thank everybody for coming. Bastiaan Rijpkema, of course, and most of all, he came the furthest, Larry Siedentop. Thank you so much. Thank you.